Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a global health challenge, already huge, basically doubling in size in, what, less than 30 years?
Yeah.
That's the reality for Parkinson's disease, according to this major news study we're diving into today.
hmm
We're talking about millions, literally millions more people projected to be living with Parkinson's by 2050. It's a number that really demands our attention.
It really does. And that number, the projected 25.2 million people worldwide, it comes from a really robust modeling study just published in the BMJ.
The BMJ, right.
And it pulls heavily on data from the Global Burden of Disease Study 2021.
Yeah.
So it's giving us one of the most comprehensive looks yet, I think, at where Parkinson's is headed globally.
Absolutely. So our mission here in this deep dive is, well, to walk you through these projections, where the numbers are going, why this massive increase is happening,
Like the drivers.
and the sometimes surprising factors the study brings up, whether it's about, location, age, sex, even socioeconomic status. We want to give you a clear, insightful picture of this growing challenge.
Right. And that headline figure, that 25.2 million cases projected for 2050, it's important to remember the study gives an uncertainty interval.
Ah, the range.
Exactly. Essentially a range where the true number is, well, very likely to fall between about 21.7 and 30.1 million.
That's still a huge range.
It is. It reflects the complexity of predicting this stuff. But, I mean, even the low end is just a massive number.
Okay, so from the study's baseline year, 2021, what kind of percentage jump are we talking about to get to that 25.2 million?
From 2021, it's a projected increase of 112%,
Wow.
more than doubling the number of people living with Parkinson's globally. And that uncertainty interval we just mentioned,
Yeah.
that translates to an increase potentially ranging from 71% to a whopping 152%.
More than double in less than 30 years. That's quite the projection. Now, numbers of people, that's one thing, but prevalence rates, they give us a better sense of the risk per person in the population, right?
Exactly.
The study looks at both all age and age standardized prevalence. Can you kind of break down why that distinction matters so much here?
Yeah, it's crucial because, look, the world's population is aging. That's a fact.
Right.
And Parkinson's is much more common in older age groups.
Right.
So just by having an older population, you're naturally going to see more cases and a higher all-age prevalence. It just makes sense.
Okay.
Age standardized prevalence, though, that adjusts for those shifts in the population's age structure. It sort of helps us see if the underlying rate or risk of the disease itself is changing, separate from just having more older people around.
Got it. So it isolates the risk factor change. What do both of those rates show for 2050?
So the study projects the all-age prevalence rate globally will reach about 267 cases per 100,000 population in 2050. That's a 76% increase from 2021.
76%.
But when you age standardize it, controlling for that aging effect,
Yeah.
the projected rate is 216 per 100,000, which is still a 55% increase from 2021.
55% increase even when you account for aging.
Yeah.
That tells you something fundamental is shifting about the risk itself, not just the demographics.
Yeah.
How does the pace of this increase compare to, say, the last few decades?
Well, this is fascinating. The study indicates the total number of cases and that all-age prevalence. They're actually projected to increase a bit more slowly between now and 2050 compared to the period from 1990 to 2021.
Oh, okay. So a slight slowdown in the overall growth.
In those specific measures, yes. However, the age standardized prevalence, that underlying risk rate we were just talking about,
Right.
that's projected to increase over the next 30 years at a pace very similar to what we saw from 1990 to 2021. So the underlying trend, that risk increase, it seems to be continuing pretty steadily.
Okay, so the risk per person is still climbing at roughly the same speed, even if the total number growth might ease off just a tiny bit compared to the past. This leads us straight to the really critical part. Why? Why is this happening? This study did this decomposition analysis, right, to break down the drivers. What did they find is the main reason behind this projected doubling of cases?
Globally, overwhelmingly, the primary driver behind the projected increase in Parkinson's cases between 2021 and 2050 is population aging.
Just aging.
The study attributes a massive 89% of the total case increase just to the fact that the world's population is getting older.
89%, just because people are living longer. That's striking.
It really is. The secondary driver is simple population growth, just, more people on the planet overall. That contributes about 20% to the case increase.
Okay, aging 89%, growth 20%. That's more than 100%.
Ah, good catch. Yeah, the decomposition percentages can add up to more than 100% because the factors can interact or offset each other slightly in the model. But the relative weights are clear. Aging is dominant.
Gotcha. And what about changes in prevalence that aren't just demographics, that underlying risk increase?
Globally, that contributes a much smaller piece of the pie to the number of cases, only about 3% globally.
Okay, so globally, the story is overwhelmingly demographics, more people living longer. But the study makes a point that these drivers look really different depending on where you are in the world, right?
Like,
And the socioeconomic level.
absolutely. That's where the nuance comes in. When we look regionally, East Asia is projected to have the largest sheer number of cases in 2050, think 10.9 million, followed by South Asia with around 6.8 million.
Huge numbers. But the biggest percentage jumps in cases are somewhere else entirely.
Exactly. Western Sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Sub-Saharan Africa, they're projected to see the most dramatic percentage increases. We're talking 292% and 246% respectively, just huge leaps.
Why such massive increases there?
Well, the study highlights that in Western Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, it's kind of a triple whammy. Substantial population aging starting to kick in, significant overall population growth, and a notable increase in that underlying prevalence rate. All three are pushing the numbers up fast.
And where are the increases projected to be smallest?
Central Europe and Eastern Europe, both projected around a 28% increase in cases.
Much lower.
Yeah, and the study links this to less dramatic population aging changes expected in those regions, and in fact, potentially a decrease in overall population in some areas, and maybe even a decrease in the underlying prevalence contributing to that smaller trend.
We also saw big differences in where the highest prevalence rates are projected for 2050, not just the number of cases.
Right. The highest all-age prevalence, just cases per 100,000 people, is projected in East Asia 821 and Western Europe at 550.
Okay.
But when we look at age-standardized prevalence, again, trying to see that underlying risk,
Yeah.
East Asia is still highest at 593, but then Andy and Latin America actually comes in second at 263 per 100,000.
Interesting. The study also grouped countries by a socio-demographic index, or SDI. Just quickly, for anyone not familiar, how can we think of SDI simply?
Think of SDI as a kind of summary score for a country's development level.
Mhm.
Combines things like average income, education levels, and fertility rates. So higher SDI generally means a more developed country.
Okay, so how does projected Parkinson's prevalence relate to this development level? Is it higher in richer countries?
Generally, yes, but it's nuanced. The study projects that the age-standardized prevalence, that underlying risk rate, tends to increase as countries develop, sort of peaking around a fairly high level of development, an SDI of about 0.8.
Okay.
And then maybe, possibly dipping slightly in the very wealthiest, highest SDI countries. But what's really striking is where the biggest increase is projected.
Go on.
Countries in the middle SDI group, think developing and rapidly developing nations, they are projected to see the highest percentage increases in both all-age prevalence, up 144%, and that crucial age standardized prevalence up 91% between now and 2050.
So they might have lower rates now, but they're projected to catch up really fast. Why is such a sharp increase specifically in those middle-income countries?
The study suggests it's tied to the rapid changes expected there over the next 3 decades. Things like accelerated population aging hitting them, significant industrialization, urbanization, overall socioeconomic progress.
Ah, so the factors associated with development are hitting them quickly now.
Exactly. These shifts can influence exposure to potential risk factors, maybe environmental, maybe lifestyle, that might be linked to Parkinson's.
And the wealthiest countries, the highest SDI group, you said their increase is lower.
Right. They're projected to have the lowest future growth in both prevalence rates and the total number of cases. And the thinking there is, well, they've already gone through a lot of this demographic and industrial transition.
They're already there, basically.
Pretty much. Severe aging, industrialization, urbanization are already well established, so there's less potential for drastic future changes compared to countries that are still rapidly transforming.
What about the lowest SDI countries? The least developed, they have the lowest prevalence now, but what's their future picture look like?
So countries in the lowest SDI group are expected to see the highest increase in the sheer number of cases, a massive 227% jump.
Wow, the highest number increase. Why?
Well, while their underlying prevalence rate might not increase quite as sharply as the middle SDI countries, their case number explosion is primarily driven by what the study calls latent population aging. Basically, their populations are just starting to age significantly now, combined with very high population growth overall.
So population growth is a bigger factor there.
Yeah, in these lowest SDI regions, population growth is actually the second biggest driver of case increase, contributing about 78% of the rise. Whereas globally, remember, aging was the top driver by far.
That's a really important distinction. The drivers are different depending on the development level. It means the challenge looks very different everywhere. Any specific country examples that really stand out from this study?
Absolutely. Looking at projected age-standardized prevalence rates in 2050, the risk rate, Spain, China, and Andorra are projected to be highest.
Okay.
But countries projected to have the highest percentage increase in that prevalence rate from where they are now. That's places like Qatar and Kuwait, though they are starting from lower absolute numbers.
Right, a big percentage jump off a low base.
Exactly. The study also estimates that roughly two-thirds of all global cases in 2050 will be concentrated in just the top 10 countries by case number.
Two-thirds in just 10 countries. And who are those top 10 projected to be in 2050?
Well, the top three are projected to be China, with a staggering 10.5 million cases,
10.5 million.
India, with 2.8 million, and the U.S. with about zero point 0.9 million. But what's interesting is who's projected to enter this top 10 list between now and 2050.
Ooh.
Indonesia and Mexico,
Yeah.
both middle SDI countries, remember, they're projected to join the top 10.
That fits the pattern we just discussed. And among those top 10 countries, which ones are seeing the biggest percentage increases in their total case numbers?
Right, so looking within that top 10 group, Indonesia, 184%,
Yeah.
Mexico, 171%, and India, 168% are projected to have the largest percentage increases.
Again, the middle upper middle SDI countries growing fastest.
Exactly. And the smallest increases within that top 10 group. That's projected for the U.S., 29%, and Germany, 38%. Again, you see that link, the lower relative increases in the highest SDI countries already further along in the demographic curve.
So geography, development level, absolutely critical lenses for understanding the future burden. What about variations by age and sex? Does the picture change across different age groups within these populations?
Oh, definitely. As you'd expect, prevalence increases significantly with age. It peaks quite late, actually, in the late 80s, around 85, 89.
Okay. And where will the largest absolute number of cases be?
The largest number of cases in 2050 are projected to be in the 60 to 79 age group, about 13 million globally. That's the biggest chunk.
And the oldest groups, people 80 plus.
Right, so people aged 80 and above are projected to have the highest prevalence rate in 2050, over 2,000 per 100,000. Extremely high rate. And crucially, they're also projected to see the highest increase in their case numbers between 2021 and 2050. Their numbers are set to rise by 196%.
Almost triple.
Yeah, it just powerfully reinforces that aging is the predominant risk factor driving these numbers up.
That all tracks with aging being the main driver we talked about, but the study had a surprising detail about younger people, didn't it?
Yes, this is really important, maybe slightly concerning finding. While older adults clearly have the highest numbers and rates overall, the study projects that people aged 20 to 40 years old,
Young adults.
yeah, young adults,
Mm.
will actually experience the greatest percentage increase in prevalence over this period, averaging about 1.2% increase per year. And this is particularly noticeable in low and low-middle STI countries.
The biggest percentage increase for 20 to 40-year-olds. How can that be if aging is the main driver overall? What could explain that?
Well, it strongly suggests that factors other than aging are starting to have a significant impact on younger populations, especially, it seems, in developing regions.
Like what kind of factors?
The study points towards potential environmental factors. Things like exposure to environmental toxins or pesticides are mentioned as possible culprits here. And this really raises a critical question, doesn't it, about when and where prevention efforts need to be focused, maybe much earlier in life, and perhaps targeted at specific environmental exposures, especially in certain parts of the world, much more than we currently emphasize.
That really does shift the focus. It's not just an old age disease if the rate is climbing fastest among young adults. Okay, what about sex differences? We generally hear men tend to have higher rates of Parkinson's. Is that projected to continue?
Yes, it is. Men are projected to continue having a significantly higher age-standardized prevalence than women in 2050. The projection is around 267 cases per 100,000 for men, compared to 163 for women.
So still a noticeable gap. Is that gap widening or narrowing over time?
According to the study's projections, the male-to-female ratio of age-standardized prevalence is actually set to increase globally. It was about 1.46 men for every woman with PD in 2021, projected to rise to 1.64 by 2050.
So the gap is widening, especially where?
Yeah, widening. And this trend is projected to be most pronounced in the high-middle SDI regions.
Any ideas from the study why that gap might be growing? Why men's rates might be increasing faster than women's?
Well, the study discusses several potential contributing factors. It mentions possible differences between sexes in lifestyles, maybe different exposures to environmental risk factors, potential hormonal influences,
Mm-hmm.
differences in the prevalence of things like metabolic diseases, and they also touch on smoking trends.
Smoking. Okay, how does smoking factor into Parkinson's projections, especially when we're talking about sex differences? This sounds complicated.
It is complicated, and this is definitely one of the study's more counterintuitive findings. Statistically speaking, smoking is associated with a lower incidence of Parkinson's disease.
Lower.
Lower. And based on this association, the study estimated that if everyone globally stopped smoking entirely,
Yeah.
the total number of Parkinson's cases in 2050 would actually increase by about 10.6% compared to their baseline projection where smoking continues its current decline.
Wait. Stopping smoking increases projected Parkinson's cases? That goes against basically every public health message out there.
It absolutely does.
Right.
And this is where the study is incredibly clear and emphatic. While that statistical association exists the data,
Okay.
the study emphasizes unequivocally that the devastating overall health harms of smoking, the massive risks of cancer, heart disease, lung disease, you name it, vastly outweigh any potential minor statistical benefit regarding Parkinson's risk reduction.
So they are absolutely not suggesting smoking as a way to prevent Parkinson's.
No way. Zero way. The study explicitly states, do not smoke to try and prevent Parkinson's. Full stop.
Right.
The point they're making is more subtle. It's that the success of global public health campaigns in reducing smoking, which is obviously a huge positive for overall health,
Of course.
might, ironically, be contributing a small amount to the overall projected rise in Parkinson's cases in their model.
Right.
Because we're removing a factor that was statistically associated with lower risk, however harmful that factor was in every other way.
Okay, I think I get it. It's a modeling observation, not health advice.
Precisely. And the fact that women globally, on average, took up smoking later than men, and maybe quit later in some places, might also play a tiny role in future sex ratio changes for PD, but again, the health message is crystal clear. Don't smoke. Period.
Health first, always. That makes total sense. Okay, so while smoking is this complex counterintuitive factor in the projections, did the study look at any other modifiable factors, things that do offer clear potential benefits for reducing Parkinson's risk?
Yes, absolutely. They look closely at physical activity.
Mm-hmm.
The study estimated that if everyone globally met recommended guidelines for regular physical activity, the total number of Parkinson's cases in 2050 could potentially be reduced by almost 5% globally.
Almost 5%. That's millions of people.
It is. And even a perhaps more achievable scenario, like getting a 20% increase in the prevalence of physical activity globally from current levels.
Yeah.
That alone could reduce projected cases by 2.6%. That translates to preventing about 650,000 cases in 2050.
650,000 fewer cases, just from a 20% bump in physical activity globally. That feels like a concrete positive target people and health systems can aim for.
It certainly seems like a key area for public health focus based on these findings.
Did the study mention any other potential protective factors, even if they didn't model them in the same detail?
Yes, they briefly cite other research suggesting potential protective effects from things like coffee consumption, tea, maybe vitamin E, but their own detailed attributable fraction analysis focused specifically on smoking and physical activity, mainly due to data availability and the robustness needed for that kind of modeling in the GBD framework.
Right, makes sense. Before we wrap up and connect this back to the listener, let's just quickly touch on the study's methodology and limitations. They used a pretty sophisticated approach, didn't they?
They did, yeah. They built these projections using the very extensive Global Burden of Disease 2021 data. They employed advanced statistical modeling, a probabilistic Bayesian model averaging approach, basically combining different models for more robust predictions.
Okay.
They also performed specific analyses, like that decomposition, to figure out the drivers, and the population attributable fractions for smoking and exercise. And importantly, they validated their model against past data from 2011 to 2021 and found it showed high accuracy for that period.
Okay, sounds robust. But like any model trying to predict the future, especially decades out, there have to be limitations the authors pointed out. What are some key ones for us to keep in mind when we hear these numbers?
Definitely. A big one is that while they accounted for major factors like demographics and the socio-demographic index, their model couldn't directly include all the potential risk factors researchers suspect might be linked to Parkinson's.
Like what?
Well, things like specific environmental toxins beyond general industrialization trends, or maybe past head injuries, genetic predispositions to some extent. That was mainly due to a lack of consistent, reliable global data on those factors. or sometimes insufficient scientific consensus on a direct causal link that meets the strict criteria used by the Global Burden of Disease study.
So the impact of some potential drivers couldn't be fully factored into these specific projections.
Right, and related to that, because of limited global data, specifically on various risk factors, they could only model the potential impact of smoking and physical activity in that detailed attributable fraction analysis, not necessarily all potential preventative factors or other risks.
Okay, what else?
Another key thing is that these projections are based on extrapolating historical trends. So they inevitably inherit limitations from variations in data quality and availability across different countries over many decades. Some areas, especially with less historical data, rely more heavily on the model's ability to estimate trends based on data from other similar regions.
So less certainty in some areas than others.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Also, they couldn't project specifically for different ethnic groups or purely genetic forms of Parkinson's, again, due to data limitations. The diagnosis criteria used in the GBD data rely mainly on clinical symptoms, which might differ slightly from diagnoses made using newer biomarkers, possibly introducing some slight variation. And technically, the model directly projected future prevalence rates based on past prevalence trends, rather than building the prediction up from separate projections of new case rates or incidence and death rates or mortality. It's just a different modeling approach. And finally, the full long-term impact of major events like the COVID-19 pandemic is still largely unknown and was only indirectly included via the GBD 2021 data used as the baseline.
All very fair points. It's crucial to remember these are projections based on the best available data and current trends, but they aren't, destiny. New discoveries, major global events, they could certainly shift the picture.
Precisely. They're our best estimate given what we know now.
So, bringing this all back to you, the listener,
Yeah.
what does this really mean? What's the bottom line here?
Well, these numbers paint a really clear picture.
Yeah.
Parkinson's disease is projected to become a significantly larger global health challenge in the coming decades.
Yeah.
I mean, that doubling projection. It affects not just the millions of individuals who will receive a diagnosis, but it ripples outwards. It impacts their families, their caregivers, their communities, and certainly healthcare systems around the world. It demands increased resources, planning, and support.
And understanding the driving factors is key, right? Primarily that wave of population aging, but also those accelerating trends in rapidly developing countries and that hint of increasing rates possibly starting in younger adults.
Yes, understanding those drivers is absolutely critical if we want to anticipate future healthcare needs and plan effectively. Where will the biggest needs be? What kind of support will be required?
And knowing the potential impact of modifiable factors like physical activity, that highlights areas where, individual choices and public health initiatives can still make a tangible difference, even against that huge backdrop of demographic shifts.
Exactly. Gives us some agency, some levers to pull.
The study's deep dive into geographical and socioeconomic differences also really underscores that this isn't a uniform global challenge. The burden, the specific drivers, and therefore the most effective responses will likely look very different depending on where you live. This has big implications for local planning and resource allocation priorities.
Absolutely. In essence, you can see these projections as a kind of call to action. A stark warning, perhaps, but also a roadmap showing where attention and resources are likely most needed globally to prepare for this growing challenge.
So to summarize then, the global burden of Parkinson's disease looks set to more than double by 2050, overwhelmingly driven by that unstoppable force of population aging, but also significantly influenced by simple population growth, the rapid development trends in middle-income countries, and possibly even these shifts in risk factors that might be affecting younger people more than before.
And the study authors themselves state very clearly that these projections should inform policy decisions, health research priorities, and how resources are allocated worldwide going forward.
Okay, so given that population aging is the biggest, almost unavoidable driver of this massive projected increase, and given that our current understanding of many other risk factors and potential preventative measures is still, frankly, incomplete, here's a final thought for you to consider. How can societies not only accelerate the crucial research into prevention, better diagnosis, and disease-modifying treatments, but also, perhaps more fundamentally, rethink how they support the millions more individuals who will be living with Parkinson's disease in 2050, support their families, and support the healthcare systems that will be striving to care for them all?